Hi, everybody. I am Nancy Siegel, Solutions for the Workplace. With me is Ellen Steverson, Starting Block Career Services. This is our podcast, Bite Size Career Strategies. We've been doing a series on Zippia's research on computer searches. Zippia, which is a major recruiting company, studied what career-related searches were being done on Google by state. And one of the prominent searches has been how to make more money. That was, in fact, the Google search. And in Hawaii, they were looking at multi-level marketing. In New Jersey, the question was how to become a billionaire. In Delaware, people were talking about how to win the lottery. And so as Ellen and I thought about this, we think it comes down to negotiating both before you get a job and while you are in your current job. So thoughts, Ellen?
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nancy. Yes, I definitely feel that most people in today's world are still struggling with that negotiation piece. In Indiana, people were looking up side hustles from home. And as we know, there's a lot of people now that are doing short-term gigs, selling little side services because we all want a little cash in our pocket. So, I think it's important. Why don't we talk first about negotiating as you're in the process of a job search? And then I would like to talk a little bit about negotiating while you're at a job, because I coach on that. And I see a lot of people making mistakes in that as well. So when you negotiate in the public sector, that is a lot different than the federal sector. And as we all know, Nancy's our federal guru. So Nancy, can people negotiate at the federal level for a job?
So, that's a great question, Ellen. It used to be when I started in the government, everybody started in the same place, and there was no such thing as negotiating. Now, however, you can, in fact, negotiate salary and you can negotiate vacation time, but you have to do it as a new entrant to the federal government. So once you're in, you kind of are where you started, and it goes from there. So it's really important for folks to understand that they can, in fact, negotiate coming into the government for the very first time. And so salary is negotiable and vacation time. However, like in the private sector, I think it's really important for folks to understand that it is an HR person's job to get new employees as cheaply as possible. No one's ever going to offer to negotiate with you from the get-go. That is your responsibility as an applicant. And I realize on the private sector side, there's a lot more flexibility. But on the federal government side, it has to be done before you accept the offer. So you will get an offer, and it is your job as an applicant to say, I really appreciate the offer. I'm excited about working here. That's the standard. But I was hoping for a salary of X. Now, you can't just make up a number, right? It has to be a justifiable number. And so how would you approach it on the private sector side, Ellen?
Right. So I totally agree with everything you had said on that. It kind of rolls over to the private sector. However, a lot of people don't realize in the private sector, it really typically is not just the HR person doing it. There's usually several people involved. So even if you negotiate with the HR person, you don't expect her to give you an answer or him to give you an answer immediately on the phone, okay? Because again, salaries, depending on the type of company, if it's a contractor, there's a lot involved with salaries that people don't realize. So again, you want to like Nancy said, one, you really need to know your facts on what the salaries are, what a fair range is. You also really need to know the skill sets you bring to the table, because they could come back and say, how do you justify, earning this? And you need to be able to say, I'm justifying this because on this project, I can come in and do this on this project. So if you've been through an interview, you now know the role a little bit and should be able to talk about how you can hit the ground running or how you can bring value that they might not have thought of. The way you model it, though, Nancy, is exactly the right way. As far as they make you a job offer, you act excited first. It's the human brain. It does hear that positivity and it's looking for that. So if you start like, well, and you sound negative, you're really kind of ruining your relationship with that. So you want to come across as very excited. Oh, this is great. I'm looking forward to working with your team and you. However, going through the interview process, I was anticipating a salary of XYZ. You can wait and see if they say something back, or if they also still pause and are waiting for you, then you have to say, is this something you could look into? Is this something we can discuss and have a closing statement so that then they say, okay. And, we don't want HR people to be the bad people here because, again, there's multiple levels in the private sector that get involved. You got to give them a little bit of time to maybe go back to the uppers and have conversations.
So I think that's a great point, Ellen. So on the federal side of things, most federal jobs are grades. So what is negotiable in terms of federal is not the grade that you're offered, but the step within that grade. Again, most federal jobs, not all of them, have 10 steps for each grade. So the likelihood is you are going to be offered step 1, and you have to justify why you think you should be a step 5. And you can't just say, well, I need to make this much money. No one cares what you need. It's not about that. It's not about your fantasy. You might say, I was making X in my current job. Here is my payroll statement that backs it up. Or you might say something along the lines of, here is the value that I'm bringing to the table, which is more than the entry of this particular grade. And I totally agree with you. The HR person cannot make the decision independently. The HR person's got to go back to the hiring manager, maybe the hiring manager's boss. They need to look at the salary you're requesting with what everyone else who's already there is making. Because unlike the private sector, the federal government, you're a public employee. And so what does that mean? That means your salary is public information. And so if people who have been there for 10, 15 years are making X, it is unrealistic to expect, unless you're really special, that you're going to come in at 2 times X. That's part of the factor that management is thinking about as well.
To me, your resume, federal or civilian, is a financial document. And what I mean by that is what you put on that resume to launch conversations will impact your negotiating ability. But if you're in a federal government interview or civilian, all of a sudden you're bringing up a skill set that was never mentioned on your resume, never brought up in an interview. And all of a sudden you're like, I've got the project management professional certificate, and that brings up, and they're like, whoa, wait a minute. You didn't have this on your resume. So you need to really think about your resume as the starting block, the launching pad of what your salary negotiations will look at, and really make sure you understand that things need to be put in these resumes, right, Nance?
Absolutely. On the federal side of things, I've heard of HR people asking applicants to put together an essay to justify the salary that they are asking for. And yes, your resume is the starting place. Now, as we've talked about in other conversations and podcasts, a federal resume is much more detailed than a private sector resume is going to be. But the things that you're bringing to the table, your value add, need to be on your resume. There's no question about it.
Right. And that's why when you're interviewing, you really want to make sure that you are comprehending and understanding what they need you to do so that when you negotiate with them, you can have a very strong conversation about how you can make things happen for them. You know, the civilian world might not have a written out step, but at the end of the day, most companies will have a salary range. So, if the range is, I'm just going to make up a number, 60 to 80,000. Why are they making somebody an offer at 60,000? You're getting the offer at 60. You say, hey, I would like 65. They say, okay, we're going to give it to you. But then the next person comes in and says they get an offer at 60 and they're like, wait a minute, I'm worth 80 and here's why. That $20,000 difference, if they make that offer at 80, the reason they're making so much more is they were able to justify and validate why they're worth more. And that's where I see people making a big mistake is they don't understand the value they bring. They've done no research on salaries. And again, we cannot live in a society where we just think, oh, I deserve this amount of money. You have to understand you tie into the business world, hence profitability, budgets, all of that tied to your salary, and you have to be able to justify it.
It's not about what you need or you want. It's about what value you bring. So, we could do, 3 hours on negotiating salary. But in addition to salary, what else is negotiable, Ellen, in the private sector?
Sometimes they will negotiate vacation time. If they have a strict policy that every new employee gets 1 day a month or 2 days a month, whatever it is, it doesn't matter that at your prior job, you had 6 weeks because you worked there for 15 years. Now you're coming back to a new company. Guess what? You got to roll your expectations back to a new hire, a new employee. They might not be willing to give you 3, 4, 5 weeks. So you have to be very careful. You don't want to come across as greedy or unhappy to come and join their team. So be aware of that, ask. And again, if it's a deal breaker on your end, then decline the job. But if it's not a deal breaker, accept it and move on. Don't try and fight it or argue it or change the world.
So let me talk about that from the federal side. So from my experience, where you fit in the salary range from a federal perspective, it's oftentimes harder to negotiate pay than it is to negotiate vacation time. So in the federal government, like everywhere else, it's very set. Everybody starts out with 104 hours of vacation time a year. And then after 3 years, it goes up. And after 15 years, it goes up again. However, on the federal government side, the federal government will consider relevant non-federal time as years of service. So if you had, as an example, 17 years of relevant experience in the private sector, you can ask for 8 hours of vacation time every 2 weeks. But again, you have to ask for it because it may not seem on the front end like vacation time has a cost, but it does.
Right.
And companies and agencies have to accrue for that time. So sometimes federal agencies are more open to negotiating vacation time than they are to negotiating pay. So that's something that if you are coming to the table with experience, you should ask for what is called on the federal side of things, advanced leave accrual. If you have between 3 and 15 years of experience, you can ask for 6 hours of vacation time, a pay period. So it's just good to know.
And I definitely feel, again, salaries, first thing to negotiate, vacation time, certainly negotiate it. And I'm not saying in the private sector they won't maybe bend it, just be prepared that they might not. Depends on the size of the organization and all that type of stuff. Now, two other things that I've helped people negotiate in the private sector is obviously equity or some type of stake in the company. Now, granted, you have to be maybe at a certain level, look for employee-owned companies, look for asking that, if you're at a higher level, again, know what you're bringing to the table and don't be afraid to ask if the opportunity is there. Then the other thing I also help people negotiate that most people don't think about is, so say you negotiate your salary, but they can't come up as high as you were hoping in the private sector, maybe even your vacation time. How about negotiating a shorter performance evaluation? So what I mean by that is most people have an annual review. If you can't come to a compromise on the salary, it's maybe not as high as you were hoping, maybe you could say to them, look, how about I accept this offer at whatever? Is it possible that when I come in, I hit the ground running, we could do a 90-day performance evaluation and a 6-month evaluation, and in 6 months, I could get a pay increase? And you might be able to negotiate that. So that's helpful as well. So those two things, don't forget about those in the private world. Now, can you negotiate that at the federal level?
Oh, no. The federal government, as we all know, is much more structured. But what I do see people negotiating, and I'm sure you do on the private sector side too, is telework. And, obviously post-pandemic, that's become of more interest to many people. I think it's important to understand as a new employee, most managers, federal or private sector, are going to want some face time. And so in most instances, there are exceptions, 100% telework when you're not a proven quantity is not that realistic, but it's something to be thinking about.
And I think, I would just like to say, people need to know before you go into these interviews or as you're interviewing what you're really willing to do, because you don't want to burn bridges. And I definitely have had people ask about telework and they're told, no, the job is in person. They keep interviewing. And then at the end, they still turn it down because they're not willing to go into work. So if you know you're absolutely not going to go into a place of business, look for telework then, or remote working nowadays. I totally agree with Nancy. I think if you are in the area, they want you to come in. And even if they're willing to give you remote work, 100% remote, there is a disadvantage in that they don't get to know you as well. So think about that. Going in a couple of days a week will really help set you apart, get you to know people, have lunch with people, things like that. So let's not eliminate that because that really can affect your wallet.
Right. So we've talked a lot about how you can make more money without a side hustle. So I want to thank everybody. I am Nancy Siegel, Solutions for the Workplace. Thank you very much. Ellen Steverson, Starting Block Career Services. Any final words, Ellen?
Not at this time. Have a great day.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit Nancy or Ellen's website for additional information about our services, a free tip sheet, which highlights our discussion today, and be sure to tune in to our next podcast, which will be posted soon. Thank you.